Good afternoon and welcome back to Girded with Truth. Thank you so much for joining us today as we start our week in the Word of God. Today we're talking about discovering me. We would like to speak about who I see. Exodus chapter 3 verses 3 to 10 says, "And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." So here we see God calling Moses, and Moses turned aside and he said, "Let me see this great sight." So Moses began to see differently, and because he began to see something different, he turned aside. He was going about his merry way. He was going about life as usual. But how many of us know that God disrupts our life to bring clarity? So God decided to show up as a burning bush. And when he showed up, Moses turned aside to see what it was. And when he turned aside to see what that was, be in the presence of God, he started to see clarity in his own situation. So the first thing Moses saw was the presence of God. And when he encountered the presence of God, he began to see himself differently. This is the same Moses that last time we saw him was fleeing from the face of Pharaoh. And instead of fleeing, he submitted himself in the presence of God. And when he submitted himself in the presence of God, God revealed himself unto Moses. And now he told Moses, take off your shoes, because here is holy. And when he recognized the holiness of God, God revealed more of himself to Moses. So we see here, who we see is based on the revelation that God has given to us. But we must obtain this in the presence of God. So first Moses sees the presence of God. And when he got deeper into the presence of God and he submitted himself unto God, God revealed who Moses was. And after he revealed who Moses was, then God revealed who he was. So after God gave Moses a deeper revelation of who he was, God gave Moses a purpose. He was no longer tending sheep in Jethro's flock, but instead, when he saw himself differently, God gave him a purpose to go to Pharaoh so that Pharaoh would free the Israelites. So God made Moses as a solution. He created him. He preserved his life, because in one season Moses was in a basket going down a river. In another season, he was fleeing from Pharaoh for killing an Egyptian. But in this season, as he discovered who God was, he discovered who he was. So he started to see himself differently based on the purpose God had called him for. So, as God called him and revealed himself to him, Moses saw himself no longer as the fleeing Moses or as the rejected Moses, but he saw himself how God saw him. And many times we have to decide who we see. Who I see will determine the direction I head in. Moses saw himself as someone who flee the face of Pharaoh, so he was tending Jethro's flock. But when God called him out and gave him a purpose, he started to see himself differently. And who we see today determines the purpose we enter into. So God is saying today, as you discover yourself, change the way you see yourself. Who I see will determine the purpose I walk in, will determine the destiny I step into, will determine where I'm headed next. So God called Moses out into his destiny to go to Pharaoh. And we know Moses to be the famous person who was instrumental in the release of the Israelites, because he went to Pharaoh and he said, "Let my people go," because that was the word God had for Pharaoh. And so many of us are a solution. We have a purpose. God has called us out. But first, we must discover ourselves. Who I see will determine where I head and which destiny I get into. So, I recommend to you, do like Moses and turn aside from life and get into the presence of God and see where He has for you to go. Your purpose is calling. Your destiny is set. All it is waiting on is for you to step into it. See yourself the way God sees you and step into your destiny. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.